Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
And our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you.
In our new continuing short series, we present the civic virtues that Benjamin Franklin, one of our most significant founders, thought to be most important. He thought these civic virtues, or qualities that help individuals become better people and contribute to a stronger society, mattered just as much as public action. As we work our way through these, think about how these civic virtues track in your own life. And we are up to the 8th civic virtue, which is justice. Franklin said, quote, "Wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty," end quote. How did you act fairly or stand up for someone? What difference did it make?
There are our virtues for this week, and Bobbi, let's get right to work.
And now our feature presentation.
We're still in our Back to the Basics, but this one is part one of what is federalism. Federalism in the U.S. government is the constitutional division of power between the national or federal government and state governments. Power is divided and shared between the federal government and state governments as designated in the U.S. Constitution. Powers granted exclusively to the national or federal government are supreme. A federal system balances power to prevent tyranny, allowing states to manage local affairs while delegating specific enumerated powers to the federal government, again, as spelled out in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Confederations are a foundational root of modern federalism. In a confederation, sovereign states delegate limited powers to a central authority for specific purposes, such as mutual defense or a shared currency. The European Union is a modern example of a confederation. Crucially, the constituent states or countries, in the case of the EU, retain most of their independence and supreme power. And the central government usually relies entirely on the states to enforce its laws or fund its operations. Prior confederations had existed in the colonies before the Revolutionary War, and some Native American tribes also created confederations, mostly for protection of their tribes and their lands. America's earliest political associations were created at a local level because the colonists found themselves to be separated from their sovereign authority and protection by the vast Atlantic Ocean. Of course, their sovereign was England, and they were also separated from their fellow colonists by a vast geographic expanse. Remember, the United States wasn't as highly densely populated then as it is now. So you have to think about how oftentimes people were far away from the next person. And big cities were not big like we think of them now. A big city like Boston or New York might have 20,000 people.
Right.
So, as a result, they organized and largely governed their day-to-day lives independently and locally. Alexis de Tocqueville commented that, quote, "In America, it may be said that the township was organized before the county before the state before the union," end quote. And just as a side note, de Tocqueville was a French diplomat, political philosopher, and historian who had traveled to the American colonies in 1731. And after that, he wrote and published Democracy in America, which is a classic 2-volume set published in 1835 and 1840, analyzing the functioning of American democracy, society, and culture after his travels in the 1830s. It explores the strengths and weaknesses of American democracy, including the tyranny of the majority, the role of the press, importance of religion, and the impact of equality, with many observations that remain relevant today. I highly recommend Democracy in America. Side note there.
Side note.
So continuing with the history of confederations in America, in 1643, the colonies of Massachusetts, New Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven established the New England Confederation because they realized that they needed to defend and secure their large territory, and again that England was so far away and caught up in their own conquests that the colonies could not depend on help from the mother country. You may have noticed some of the names of those colonies like New Plymouth and New Haven. The 13 colonies weren't always what we think of generally and what we study as the final 13 colonies. Like in the beginning, there was Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so they grew and changed over time. So that's why those different names came up there. The charter for the New England Confederation says, quote, a firm and perpetual league of friendship and amity, which means friendship, for offense and defense, mutual advice and succor, which means help, upon all just occasions, both for preserving and propagating the truth and liberties of the gospel and for our own mutual safety and welfare, end quote. This union lasted for 4 decades until King James II folded these colonies into the new Dominion of New England in 1684. In 1754, the colonies once again found the need to confederate because of mutual urgent concerns, including problems with Native Americans and the threat of a French attack. Representatives from the colonies adopted the Albany Plan of Union in 1754, which would have a Grand Council with a representative from each colony and a President General appointed by the British government to preside over the council. One of the most prominent supporters of the Albany Plan was Benjamin Franklin. His well-known Join or Die political sketch was first published in Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette on May 9th, 1754. It's the political sketch you have all probably seen. I know it was always in our 8th grade history books, and you see it sometimes still depicted today. It shows a snake cut into 8 pieces, with each piece labeled with the initials of one of the colonies, and the headpiece is labeled N.E. for the 4 New England colonies. Join or Die later becomes a rallying cry for support of the Revolutionary War and may be the earliest pictorial representation of the nation's blossoming federalism. It's worth noting that neither the New England Confederation nor the Albany Plan of Union sought to sever ties with England, and in fact, Franklin hoped the latter would help to increase British participation in the colonies. He said, quote, Britain and her colonies should be considered as one whole and not as different states with separate interests, end quote. Unfortunately, the colonial legislatures and the British Crown both rejected the Albany Plan, but it is important as an early model and call for mutual cooperation between the colonies.
My mind as a news guy can't help but wander over to coverage this week on every channel when King Charles was here and with our president, and he spoke on Capitol Hill and he talked about democracy
and separation of powers and checks and balances.
Yes. And it's interesting because who would have ever thought the King of England would be standing in America talking about these
giving
things
a history,
to us?
American history lesson. And it kind of makes me think too, kind of on that same thing, that what the framers eventually formed with our Constitution and these ideas have spread throughout the world. A lot of other countries' constitutions and forms of government copied what we did.
Yeah. And I think that just as the plan for democracies in countries spread and became popular, that we may be going through a period or becoming to the end of a period where authoritarianism, we've seen it spreading a little bit, but then what happened in Hungary, we're pulling back towards democracy.
Thank God. The Revolutionary War created a need for some centralization and cooperation among the colonies. The demands for raising an army, supplying it, placing it under a central command, and raising funds to pay for it exceeded colonial capabilities. But the leaders of the colonies and soon-to-be states recognized the need for an agreement of cooperation, but they remained deeply suspicious of centralized power. With the Revolutionary War raging, the Continental Congress adopted the United States' first Constitution, which we've talked about on numerous other podcasts, which was called the Articles of Confederation, and they passed that in Congress in 1777, and they utilized it during the war, despite colonial leaders not ratifying it until March 1st, 1781. So it was actually kind of in effect for like 3.5 years, even without complete colonial approval. Right. But without that, I'm not sure that they would have made it through the war because there was just no central way to organize the war effort. So it was definitely something they needed. But It set up a unitary form of government, not a federal system, and it left the states as the sovereign power. And just as a reminder, sovereign means that's where the majority of the power lies.
Yes.
So the states remained the most powerful part under the Articles of Confederation. With a unitary government or one house Congress, each state only had one vote, and there was no central leader and no judiciary. A unitary system has only one central authority that prevails over the entire country. In a unitary system, subdivisions within, such as the states, are usually entirely subordinate to the national government and exist entirely to carry out its commands. But that wasn't the way it was under the Articles of Confederation. The national government under the Articles proved to be very weak due to its limited powers and resources, and the states largely remained independent and more powerful. The central government under the Articles could not levy taxes and had to depend upon the states for revenue. There was no standing army or navy, and it was often difficult to get the majority vote needed to exercise what limited powers it did have. Any change to the Articles required a unanimous vote. Disputes among the states were difficult to resolve, and the central government was underfunded and unable to compel delinquent states to pay their share of the costs of the war and post-war needs. So basically, what happened is during the Revolutionary War, under the Articles, the Congress that existed tried to get funds or money from the states to help pay for the war effort, but they fought amongst themselves, like I paid more than you did.
Right.
So it was very difficult. And even after the war, until the new Constitution was passed, they were still squabbling over this state owes X amount of dollars because we paid.
Mm-hmm.
So it was something that had to be settled at some point. Or else it was just going to end up, we were going to be like 13 countries rather than states.
Like 13 fighting cousins.
Right, right.
The other thing I like to keep in my mind for context is whenever we're talking about the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, to get people to agree and be up to date on things was really hard because we didn't have all these forms of communication. It was before radio and TV. We had some newspapers later on in that period, but like to get a consensus of 13 different groups and states would be extremely difficult. Though on the other hand, I have to imagine with as much information overload and disinformation that we have going around today, that it's equally as hard.
Just a different time and a different set of circumstances that caused difficulty. But it was this ineffectiveness under the Articles that led to a call for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation in the summer of 1787, which led to the creation of our new Constitution in 1787.
And we know that was an unusually warm period of time when they got together to meet and discuss that.
A time of secrecy.
It was. No windows, pull the blinds.
Keep the windows down.
Take off your wig maybe in there.
Sweat away.
Yeah. I hear the bell, so let's shift gears.
Don't know much about history.
This is our segment, Don't Know Much About History. Throughout the American Revolution, the written word was a powerful tool for spreading ideas and rallying support for independence. Revolutionaries recognized the importance of communicating their ideas, their grievances, and their arguments on behalf of independence to both the colonists and the world. Writers used pamphlets, essays, and books to advocate for the colony's right to self-government and to unite the population against British rule. One of the most influential and widely read writings of the time was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in early 1776. It boldly called for independence and criticized the monarchy. Over 60,000 copies were published. Paine's clear and compelling argument resonated with the colonists and pushed many to support the cause of independence. Now, interestingly enough, Thomas Paine was English-born and had only arrived in America in 1774 with the help of Benjamin Franklin. Paine also published another essay later in 1776 called The American Crisis. It was meant to inspire the Americans to continue their fight against the British.
All right, there's the bell. That's your history lesson for this week. Let's jump back into the episode.
If you've listened to our episodes 7 through 11 from season 1, which were all called How Did Our Constitution Originate?, then you are somewhat familiar with the reasons for the Convention of 1787 and the discussions, compromises, and agreements that took place that summer in Philadelphia. But just as a short refresher, the convention was called to fix or revise the Articles of Confederation, not write a whole new constitution. The challenge that faced the delegates was how to fix it and preserve state sovereignty. The fears of a central government that would accumulate too much power and erode state sovereignty, along with the fear that no central government could govern such a huge expanse of territory as the United States, then hovered over the convention throughout. Although the word federalism does not appear anywhere in the Constitution, the idea permeates the structure of the government that the document created. The challenge was to preserve the sovereignty of the states within a national government that could operate on a world stage, resolve interstate conflicts, especially those debts that were still owed for the war, and to further common interests. The solution the framers developed and that the states eventually adopted was the federalism embodied in the U.S. Constitution that has now been in effect for just shy of 237 years of our almost 250-year history of the United States,
which we're going to be celebrating this summer.
So how did the framers pull off creating this enduring federal system of government, this experiment? First of all, by creating the 3 branches of government with separation of powers and checks and balances, which we discussed in our last episode. They also created the legislative branch as the most powerful branch in the sense that it makes the laws. But because the framers knew that many mistrusted the concentration of political power in one person or group, they carefully limited the powers of Congress or the legislative branch. So on the one hand, it's powerful because it makes our laws, but it's still not really considered more powerful than the other 2 branches because they can all check
equal
the power of each other, right? So when you heard me say that it's the most powerful branch, you have to take that into consideration about, yes, the laws are powerful, but they can still be changed or checked or whatever.
And we see that all the time. I mean, we're going to talk about later the student ID law here in Indiana, where the legislative body created a rule and now it's working its way through the court system to be checked.
So examples of the limitations can be found first in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which lists the specific powers granted to Congress. These are known as the enumerated powers, which enumerate means to list. There are 17 specific powers listed and one general 18th power, the necessary and proper clause, which is also known as the elastic clause. And if you're not familiar with that, we also discussed that back in episode 11 from June of last year. Over time, 3 of the powers enumerated to Congress have proven to be controversial and have been interpreted to allow the expansion of federal powers and put restrictions on state powers. Those are what are known as the Commerce Clause, the Taxation Clause, and the Necessary and Proper or Elastic Clause. And we're going to talk about those in the second episode of this.
This is this is a two-parter.
At least a two-parter, because today we're just kind of covering the background and structure, and then we'll get into
the meat,
how it's been used, I guess is the best way to say it in the next episode. Another limit on Congress's power can be found in Article 1, Section 9, which prohibits Congress from doing several things, including banning the importation of slaves before 1808, which was one of the compromises from the convention in order to get support of the slave states. And we talked about that back in those early episodes. Also, not being able to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which we talked about in episode 12 from June of last year. Also, it cannot draw money from the Treasury without an appropriations bill. Congress cannot grant titles of nobility, and there are several other restrictions as well. Finally, the Bill of Rights limits what Congress can and cannot do. For example, the wording of the First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law, and that's a quote. So they can't establish a national religion or abridge freedom of speech or press. So there's restrictions on what Congress can or can't do. And then also in the Eighth Amendment, Congress is prohibited from levying, quote, excessive fines and imposing, quote, cruel and unusual punishments, end quote, on convicted criminals. Some other key provisions in the Constitution related to federalism include Article 1, Section 10, which prohibits or limits states from regulating certain areas. For example, states cannot enter into treaties with foreign nations. States can't make their own money. They also can't grant titles of nobility or assign guilt to a person without court proceedings. Also, without congressional approval, states cannot collect taxes on imports or exports, build an army or have warships in a time of peace, or enter into war. Finally, Article 6 of the Constitution, often known as the Supremacy Clause, makes the, quote, Constitution and the laws of the United States and all treaties made the supreme law of the land, end quote. Under this structure, all powers the Constitution neither delegated to the federal government nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states or the people. This last structure was later made explicit in the 10th Amendment when the Bill of Rights was added in 1791. And that was partly because the anti-federalists, they were still wary of this new Constitution giving this federal government too much power. Right. So even though in the Constitution body, some of those limits were listed, they wanted it to be even more clear.
Yes, so more explicit, yeah.
Yes, the reason for the 10th Amendment. Article 6 also states that all public officials, both of the United States and the various states, are bound by their oath to the Constitution above all. And to ensure freedom of religion, it also states that no public official shall be required to practice or pledge allegiance to any particular religion. In the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay promoted state ratification of the new Constitution. In Federalist number 9, Hamilton attempted to lessen concerns that the states would lose sovereignty under the new Constitution. In Federalist number 51, Hamilton also argued that federalism would help limit the ability of the proposed new central or national government to abuse its powers because of separation from powers and checks and balances. The Federalist Papers repeatedly addressed concerns that the proposed federal government would run roughshod over the states. In Federalist number 39, Madison focused on the limited powers of the federal government and the continuing sovereignty of the states. He also makes a distinction that the proposed federal government is a government of limited enumerated powers, not a national government with boundless overarching power. The Federalist Papers emphasized that while the states retain their sovereignty, some limits on the power of the states were essential for the welfare of the American people. The Anti-Federalists were concerned that the citizens would be, quote, necessarily unknown, end quote, to the national representatives due to the size of our new country. Like I said earlier, there were great distances between a lot of the people, especially, there weren't as many large cities or even medium-sized cities at the time. A lot of people lived rural out in the country.
And getting from a big populated city to rural took a lot of time.
And like you said, there's no TV, radio, so they relied on what little written information they might be able to access, maybe if they went to a, market somewhere, or anti-federalists were fearful that those people would be the unknowns, would have no voice. Many remained fearful also of a powerful central government and demanded a Bill of Rights be added quickly to offset their concerns. That's why when the Bill of Rights was added in 1791, the primary purpose of the 9th and 10th Amendments was to ensure the limit on the power of the federal government, protect unenumerated rights of the people, and affirm the authority of the states. Together, they act as catch-all clauses in the Bill of Rights to ensure federal authority remains limited only to the powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. The Ninth Amendment states, quote, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people," end quote. It makes it clear that just because a right is not explicitly listed in the Bill of Rights, it doesn't mean citizens do not possess it. It protects, quote, "unenumerated rights, those inherent to individuals." The framers understood that it would be impossible to list all of the rights and liberties that should be protected from government interference. And I might add there, we've talked before, they made this document also so that it could be amended or changed because they realized times would change. Rights people wanted may not even have been thought about.
How could they regulate the internet when it didn't exist?
Right. The 10th Amendment states, quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people," end quote. This was meant to define the principle of federalism. Any power not expressly given to the federal government is automatically kept by the states or the citizens. This preserves state sovereignty over issues like education, marriage, and local policing, limiting federal overreach.
And elections?
And elections, yes. So if you think about it, and I think we've touched on this before, most of the things that affect us in our daily lives are things that the states control or regulate, like elections and marriage and education and so forth. Now, the federal government may have, there's an education department.
Sure.
They may hand down some regulations to make sure like all 50 states are doing things the same or whatever. Still, what most affects us comes from the state or local government. So since the late 1700s, back then people thought of themselves more as a part of their state rather than as the country as a whole.
Sure.
And and that goes up to the Civil War. And it's not really until after the Civil War happens and after that time that people start really thinking of themselves as a U.S. citizen more than as a citizen of just their state. So that's kind of thinking that evolves over time, that we're together, all 50 of us, rather than, oh, I'm just Indiana and I'm just going to do my own thing.
Right.
So
there's an importance to us feeling that collective American pride, that there is a big job that does to keep us cohesive. I know when we watched that space capsule go up into space for the first time in years, I felt American pride, and that's important, but it's also important that we don't give up our state rights.
Some of that's a history lesson too, that, one of the things that the Civil War was fought over was states' rights. And the Civil War settled that issue, that if your state has agreed to join this union, then there are some things that the federal government has superiority over. I think it just kind of helped solidify how we have to think about. We're a huge country and we need to think in terms of protecting the whole.
Right. We got to protect the motherland with our military, right?
And then our local. So was a whole kind of switch in thinking from revolutionary times to Civil War and post-Civil War.
And it's a delicate dance, is it not? Like a tight wire to, we want control locally, but we also need some things like protection. Yes.
In 1787, when the new Constitution was conceived and written, most people believed that the states were more important than the national government. There you go. And that people would feel a stronger attachment to the states. James Madison even suggested that if the national government tried to interfere with state authority, the states would defeat it in a war.
Wow.
Madison's vision almost became a reality with the Civil War, but the national government won. In our next episode, we will look at how the concept of federalism has evolved and changed since its inception in 1787 under the U.S. Constitution.
All right, so that's the end of part one. Thank you on federalism, and we will be picking up with part two in our next episode. But first, there's that bell. Pop quiz time. Bueller.
So last episode's question, how many justices are there on the U.S. Supreme Court? If you said 9, ding, ding, ding. You get the prize. However, remember that has has and still
Fluctuated,
could
yeah.
change. Oh, that's up to Congress, and it has been different over the course of time.
Yeah, we've had more,
Court
actually,
packing.
more than 9.
Yeah, that's what they call court packing when they want to
Was that during FDR?
one of the times, but
Yeah.
there have been other times that it's gone up and down, and that's because it's not set in the Constitution how many there will be. So
We've sort of, in our lifetime, we've sort of just gotten, I'll speak for my generation, gotten used to 9.
Right.
But that could soon change. Who knows?
Yep.
All right, Bobbi, so do you have a new question for us?
Yes, our question this time is, who is the Chief Justice of the United States right now?
And we'll answer that in our next episode. And before we go, there are a couple things playing out currently as we speak that we want to address. And if I could just squeeze one in real quick as a reporter. So I woke up this morning and I looked at my phone and I had a breaking news alert and I read it. And here's what it is. The United States just dropped to 64th out of 180 countries in the 2026 Press Freedom Index from the Reporters Without Borders. It is the lowest ranking ever and down 7 spots from last year. The report now classifies the U.S. as having a problematic environment for journalists. Analysts point to the political pressure, legal challenges, economic strain on newsrooms, and declining public trust as key factors driving that decline. So that was not the news I wanted to wake up to.
That's not surprising, but sad.
Yeah. And so one other thing is we recorded our last episode. We were talking about student IDs and whether or not they could be used as identification at polling sites. And some things have changed with the enacted Senate Bill number 10. What's the latest on that?
We had already recorded the episode, and the state attorney general took it to the court, and the appeals court temporarily put the Senate bill back into effect. But there are groups that are appealing that decision. But until then, once again, student IDs cannot be used until this goes through the courts. So, like I was reading Purdue's Exponent, which is their student newspaper, was talking about, how that affected quite a few Purdue students who thought they were going to be able to vote. And then all of a sudden they couldn't vote because they don't have an ID that's appropriate. They would have to go back to their home base to vote, which, if you live far away, that's not going to work very well.
No. And as we record this today, we are just 2 days away from Election Day in Indiana. So nothing is going to change.
And it's the end of their term. So
there are graduations already happening.
Students going to have time to go 200 miles to the southern part of the state or whatever, just so they can vote. So it's going to affect the outcome, but hopefully before the fall election, that it'll make its way through the courts and be decided. Yeah. Because students will be back in college at the time of the fall election. So we want them to be able to vote.
And there were tens of thousands of the students affected here in Indiana. We're not just talking about, a few hundred. There were tens of thousands that are affected. And I am an advocate of making voting easier, taking away hurdles. We should be able to vote, and that for either side, right? If you're popular and you are doing your job, then you would think that you would want as many people to vote as possible because you're popular doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're their voice, you're their vote. So lots of times I get bogged down in thinking, why are we creating all these obstacles to the ballot box?
And not only that, but we were talking before the gerrymandering. Of course, we had the thing with Louisiana this week with courts saying, knocking down their maps. And so now there are governors wanting to postpone their primary. And, I just think back to when we were talking about this in one of our episodes not too long ago. We talked about gerrymandering, and now there's been more uptick this week in talks in Congress to try to get a bill passed that would stop gerrymandering. And it's the most talk I've heard about it in quite a long time. So maybe, eventually we'll get a bill passed that stops gerrymandering.
Can you explain to me, I know in Indiana, one party has control of all the levers, right? Governor's office, House of Representatives, and the Senate. I'm assuming in Louisiana, probably a similar situation. And they were the first. I mean, my goodness, within hours after that happened, they were saying, hold up, we're going to, people have already voted on early voting, but we're going to redraw.
What do you do with those votes, the people that already voted?
Exactly. But my question is, if that party in control is wanting to change the maps, what has changed since they approved them? Because if they hold the majority in those states, they signed off on those maps that now they're saying, oh, hit the brakes.
Right.
We want to change those. So I don't understand what's happened.
Well, I think it comes from above. And I don't mean
you're not talking heaven.
I'm not talking heaven either. So, but yeah, I think there needs to definitely be legislation that just puts a stop to it. And and when we talked about gerrymandering several episodes ago, I mean, not every state does it the same, or I mean, it's based on their own state constitutions as to how that's handled. But, there could be some, and this would fall under federalism. I mean, Congress could pass a law that I suppose could say something like, you absolutely cannot change a map at this time. It can only be done like at certain times, like what we've seen
after a census, maybe.
Right. That is the only time you can do it.
Right.
Or, I mean, I don't know what they're thinking, but
because Bobbi, if we don't fix this, we're going to spend maybe the next 2 years, or who knows, that's all we're going to be doing. Like, it's going to be chaos with every election. And
monetarily too, how much like if in Louisiana, for example, some people have voted, does that mean now they're going to have to rework their ballots and then those people are going to have to either not vote or go back and vote again, or I mean, it's
right. And yeah, when you talk about financially, who's paying for that? The taxpayers are, and it's probably the local ones, the ones in that state that are going to have to pay for them to reprint ballots and rework all of these things. And it does disenfranchise some people who may not make it back to the poll to cast a vote. And it just really makes me question.
And I think too, especially living in a rural county, a lot of times smaller, less populated counties don't have the funds. That I just see a myriad of problems and things that it affects to try to change things midstream.
It's going to be a long road to November, sister.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you for all the hard work. I know you put a lot of work into this one. Thank you for getting us to think of the word federalism in a more enlightened frame of mind, because it does affect us, and it's not just a term that it sounds like a complicated word, but when you break it down, it really does truly affect us.
And hopefully people, especially if they listen to the last one, they're maybe finally kind of starting to put the pieces together about checks and balances and federalism, and for some terms that they may have heard before, but like you said, maybe didn't really know what they meant or how they worked, how they kind of work together.
When we see how it affects us, I think that's the key to turning on the light bulb. You mention this all the time, and I want to underscore it. Go back and listen. You don't have to listen to us in any certain order except on the two-parters. It makes sense there. But go back and listen. We've been doing this over a year now, and we've covered a lot of things. And we've covered, as you were just talking about, when they met to revise the Articles of Confederation, there are lots of things that we've talked about that you can go back and revisit. Those episodes are still live. We'd love for you to come check them out. One other thing before we run out of time here is please check out our Facebook page, Plain Civics. Just put it in Facebook. We're there, and you can comment. That's where Bobbi also posts the answers to our pop quiz. I'm a little behind. It's okay. They'll get there. And it's another way you can communicate with us, either through Messenger, or you can send us an email, plaincivicspodcast@gmail.com. So lots of ways to communicate with us, and we would love to get feedback, even if it's negative feedback. Please take the time and write us, and we definitely will respond. So Bobbi, again, thank you for the hard work this week. That's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works, so you can make the government work for you.